In this video, we're going to go a little bit deeper on the world in front of the text. We'll talk about how we might engage the world in front of the text. We'll compare this method to more analytical methods of exegesis. We'll discuss the ideas of objectivity and subjectivity in exegesis, and specifically how subjectivity plays into engaging the world in front of the text. We'll talk about why we're beginning with the world in front of the text rather than the world behind the text or the world of the text. I'll show you a few resources you might use to engage the world in front of the text, and then I'll give you some different strategies for how you might personally go about engaging the world in front of the text. So let's start over here with our hermeneutical circle. So returning back to this idea that was introduced in the last video, remember the idea of the hermeneutical circle or the hermeneutical spiral is that you can sort of start with any of these three different worlds: the world behind the text, the world of the text, or the world in front of the text. In this class, we are first introducing the world in front of the text, so we're sort of starting there, and then we're going to move to these other worlds. And the process of exegesis is very much going through these different worlds, sort of circling around and engaging the text over and over again in different kinds of ways in order to draw out meaning from the text for us personally, or for what we think the text might have meant for the audience for which it was written in the ancient worlds. And we're talking about the world in front of the text. We're really focused sort of on modern readers, how the text affects us and what we personally bring to the text, our own worlds, our own reading approaches and technologies, and also how the text has been received throughout history and how it might presently be received in different kinds of social communities and by different persons who have different social locations and different kinds of lived experiences. So Michael J. Gorman, in one of our readings from this week, he distinguishes between the engaged approach to exegesis and the analytical approach to exegesis. And starting with the world in front of the text is really sort of an engaged approach to exegesis. So his sort of definition of this engaged approach is, he says it's fundamentally a postmodern way of interpreting biblical texts that seeks to engage them as something more than historical or literary artifacts. The interpreter has a personal vested interest in the text and its interpretation. So you can see here how the world in front of the text is sort of at the fore in the so-called engaged approach to exegesis that Michael J. Gorman distinguishes from the analytical approach to exegesis over here, which he defines as fundamentally a modern way. So notice there's a difference there. The engaged approach is a postmodern way of engaging the text, and the analytical approach is a modern way of studying the text that seeks to understand them in terms of their historical development, their literary features, or both. So here you can see how the analytical approach is really interested in the world behind the text. You see that historical development there, and their literary features, that is the world of the text itself, or both of these. So the analytical approach is really going to be interested, or at least going to start with the world of the text and the world behind the text. And so to directly sort of compare these two different approaches, the engaged approach and the analytical approach, I've made us a little T-chart. So we have on the left-hand side our engaged approach, the right-hand side our analytical approach. And as noted in those definitions, the engaged approach is really a postmodern and also a pre-modern way of engaging the text. That is to say, it is sort of less scientifically influence. It's less about sort of putting on the gloves and trying to dissect the text in a really objective kind of way that's influenced by Enlightenment thinking. The analytical approach, in contrast, is more like that. It's more about putting on the white gloves, trying to do this sort of more sterile dissection of the text and really thinking about what the text meant in its original context. And this is a very modern Enlightenment way of approaching and thinking about texts, biblical or otherwise. So as we noted, the engaged approach is going to start with the world in front of the text, and the world in front of the text is going to be what's most important for engaged approaches to exegesis, whereas for analytical approaches to exegesis, the world behind the text and the world of the text is really going to be the focus. And sort of when it comes to how the text is viewed in these two different approaches, for the engaged approach, the text is really something that is necessarily going to have an influence. It had an influence in the past and will have an influence in the future. So it's the text is viewed as something that is going to influence the world. It's going to influence the person that is reading it, but it's also going to influence sort of the wider structures of the world, the way that politics work, the way that religion and theology and sort of different systems work. The engaged approach is really going to sort of take that as fundamental. This idea that the text is going to have an effect, and so we ought to recognize that from the beginning. It's not sort of the text is not sort of this thing that just existed in the past and doesn't continue to influence the present. And that is more like what the emphasis is in the analytical approach to exegesis. The text is really this sort of historical and literary artifact, and the idea is that if we can sort of just study it carefully enough, if we can take our scientific tools and apply them to the text, we can extract the meaning out of it in a sort of scientific and objective way. And so this is our last point here on this T-chart, is that the engaged approach is very subjective. That is, it is concerned with the subject. The reading subject is central, the reading subject being us as readers or other persons as readers. Whereas the analytical approach is not so much about us or about the reader per se, but more about the object, the text, the thing that is being read. So in the analytical approach, it's much more the text lies in front of one, and they take their analytical objective tools, apply it to the text, and try and draw something out of the text in an objective kind of way. And this has been the sort of main critique of the so-called analytical approaches to exegesis, focusing solely on the world behind the text or the world of the text while ignoring the world in front of the text. And I want to state from the outset of this class that focusing on the world behind the text and the world of the text and sort of taking the scientific tools, your exegetical methods, and applying them to the text is not a bad thing. It's only a bad thing when we ignore our own social locations, the social locations of others, and the ways that the text is has been and will continue to have effects in the real world. And so to get at a sort of this critique of the sort of myth of objectivism, in these more analytical approaches. I'm going to give us two different quotes from from some of the readings for this week. The first one is from Dr. Angela N. Parker in a little book called If God Still Breathes, Why Can't I? She states, white male biblical scholarship is linked to the idea of objectivity in the academic study of the Bible. For generations, biblical scholars studied under the belief that objective inquiry was the prime way to do biblical scholarship. That is, keeping one's personal thoughts and feelings away from any inquiry into the biblical text. Objective reality as a stance for biblical interpretation is, I argue, in that book she argues, one of the systemic evils of academic biblical studies. So to claim that one can be objective, to claim that one does not bring their self to the text in the act of interpretation is not a good thing for Dr. Angela N. Parker. And the same is going to be true for Dr. Ekaputra Tupamahu. He writes here in one of the readings for this week, whiteness in biblical scholarship is invisible because most of white biblical scholarships do not acknowledge it. Whiteness is a ghost that has haunted biblical scholarship. In order to thwart this ghost, we have to name it to make it visible. The decentering of whiteness in biblical scholarship has to begin with this act of conjuring whiteness. White biblical scholars can no longer pretend that they are objective, disinterested, and culturally transcendental. They are as localized, particularized, and historicized as other readers of the Bible. And so the critique here, and the sort of the present critique, or the critique that has really arisen of sort of analytical, objective approaches to biblical scholarship in recent years, is the critique is that it's sort of pretending to be objective, is that no one is actually objective in their reading of the biblical text or any of the other texts. We always come to the act of reading as persons who have lived experiences, who are coming from particular social locations, and that this idea of objectivity is really connected to the sort of dominance of whiteness in the Biblical Academy in particular, but also in the academy at large, and sort of scholarship, that minoritized scholars and scholars from different social locations that are unlike my own personally have sort of brought their own vested interests and named those. And in many cases, those have been sort of dismissed as that is, not a scientific way of engaging biblical text. You need to leave yourself behind. You need to leave your experiences behind and just come to the text with your exegetical tools and engage the text in an objective sort of way. And the critique is then that is sort of a really modern Enlightenment and really sort of Eurocentric way of approaching the biblical text that's ultimately not possible. It's, again, using those tools is not a bad thing, but to pretend like we are using those tools objectively without also recognizing what we bring to the text and what others bring to the text is where the danger of sort of ignoring other perspectives comes in. And so that is the reason for which, or one of the reasons for which, we start with the world in front of the text in this class. So the first thing I want to note is that I personally do not understand myself to be training you to be an objective biblical scholar or an objective pastor or an objective proclaimer of Scripture, preacher of Scripture, who thinks that they can just come to the text in an objective way, extract the meaning, and then hand that meaning on to someone else. So my goal is not to train you to be that way, to not sort of do the white male biblical scholar mode. And oftentimes the white male biblical scholar mode is Angela and Parker calls it sort of training in crap that no one cares about. That we also often have these long-standing debates that really aren't that interesting and really don't, in many cases, have a real effect. One, on the way that we live out the biblical text, or the way that we sort of interpret and apply the biblical text, but also it's this sort of this crap that no one cares about is doesn't have any effect on sort of the lived experiences of real people that you could know a whole lot about, the sort of grammatical debates about a particular passage, and at the end of the day that doesn't matter in the real world, theologically or otherwise. And so I think a sort of good antidote to this is beginning with our own lived experiences and beginning with the lived experiences of others. So focusing on that and recognizing from the outset that we bring something as readers to the reading and the interpretation of the biblical text. And that's something to be celebrated. That's not something to be sort of pushed to the side or ignored. So your own experiences, your own unique embodiedness, who you are as a person in a body, the way that you think, your social location, your family upbringing, these things all really matter for your interpretation of the biblical text. And I encourage you to bring them in to your interpretation of the biblical text, because these things affect our study. They affect the way that you think about the text, and they affect the sort of meaning that you're going to draw out of the text and the things that you find interesting or important about the text. And lastly, I want to state that being a white scholar is not inherently bad. I am, in fact, a white male biblical scholar. What is bad, or what should be avoided, is sort of not acknowledging the power dynamics that have long been sort of historically at play within seminary context, within the biblical academy, within biblical scholarship at large. That there's sort of long been a whitewashing in biblical scholarship, and starting with the world in front of the text. And acknowledging our own social locations. For me, a lot of that is acknowledging my own privilege as a white male biblical scholar. Starting with that is sort of this antidote to pretending that we can be objective and pretending that our identities don't matter in the interpretation of the biblical text, because they very much do. And so to sort of return back to the idea of the engaged approaches to exegesis, Michael Gorman, in one of the readings for this week, he's going to divide these engaged approaches that all begin with the world in front of the text into three different categories. The first is so-called ideological criticism. The second is contextual criticism. And the third is theological exegesis. So the first of the three, ideological criticism, is really going to sort of bring various ideologies from the outside of the person, not necessarily are always related to who they are as a person, but these are all sort of tied together by being a sort of outlook on the world and an outlook on how one might approach the biblical text. In some cases here, these are very much about one's identity and one's embodiedness, but one can do sort of any of these kinds of approaches without having a particular identity or having a particular embodiment. So some examples of these, and the sort of primary examples of these, are liberation exegesis, the idea of approaching the text through the lens of liberation, that God is always first and foremost for the oppressed. And how, if we start with that and approach the text with that idea, how is that going to change the way that we think of it? Feminist and womanist exegesis are closely related to one another. They begin with the concerns of women, and taking a lens that is feminist and that looks out for the power structures that may have sort of suppressed women, these kinds of things. And womanist exegesis, closely related, is particularly going to be concerned with interpreting the biblical text from the perspective of Black women. Post-colonial criticism is going to think about how the Bible does and does not relate to colonization in the past and in the present. Ecological hermeneutics is very much going to be concerned with sort of creation care, thinking about things like the climate crisis in conversation with the biblical text. Disability hermeneutics is going to think about the biblical text from the perspective of disability studies, from the perspective of persons who have certain physical or mental disabilities. How do they show up in the text? How do they get stereotyped in the text? Or how might the text be liberative for persons living today who live with particular physical or mental disabilities? The last one here is queer hermeneutics, reading the biblical text from the perspective and with the concerns of LGBTQIA persons and their communities in mind. Contextual criticism, generally speaking, the through line for contextual criticism is going to be about one's particular identity and social location. So who you are as an embodied person, and oftentimes is going to have an ethnic dimension to it. So you'll see sort of African hermeneutics, Black hermeneutics, Asian hermeneutics, indigenous or native hermeneutics, and then hybrid hermeneutics is going to be sort of any mixture of one's ethnic identity. So with respect to contextual criticism, all of these are going to approach the biblical text thinking first and foremost through the lens of what it means to be African, Black, Asian, Native, or have a hybrid ethnic identity, and how that affects one's reading of the text and what might come out of one's reading of the text. Theological criticism is going to be particularly interested in how the text has meaning for the church in some way or another. So canonical criticism is going to be concerned with how a particular biblical text or passage relates to other passages in the biblical canon, how it sort of jibes or does not jibe with them. Theological exegesis might also be interested in how particular passages inform theology and particular theological debates or particular theological systems, which sort of relates to congregational hermeneutics as well. This idea of how does the Bible work in different denominational settings? What's its importance in liturgy and in worship? The missional hermeneutics is this idea of sort of thinking about the mission of God as a lens by which we approach Scripture. How do we see the mission of God, the Missio Dei, at work within a biblical passage? Pre-modern interpretation is really going to be concerned about thinking about how theologians and Christians in the past, particularly in the pre-modern past, so before the Enlightenment era, were thinking about and receiving the biblical text, how they were interpreting it. And then spiritual or sacred reading is going to be doing things like Lectio Divina, where you're reading the text and really sitting with it and thinking about how it impacts you theologically, how it impacts your own relation with the triune God, and then how that might what might that mean for what you bring out of the text, the meaning that you sort of draw out in a spiritual or sacred sort of way. So here I offer you a number of different tools, and these are of course not the only tools by which one might do the engaged approach to exegesis, or how one might start with the world in front of the text. But these are all the kinds of tools that we might characterize as engaged approaches to exegesis, or approaches to exegesis that begin with the world in front of the text. So this first one here is the Wisdom Commentary series. This was in our syllabus as one of the options for a commentary text. The Wisdom Commentary series is explicitly a feminist commentary series written by women, and it also has sort of a theological bent to it. So you could sort of characterize this one here as both a feminist way of doing exegesis and also a theological way of doing exegesis, which raises another point, is that sort of those different approaches on that last slide are not necessarily mutually exclusive from one another. One can approach the text with different sort of ideologies at the same time. The next one here is Latino Biblical Hermeneutics, an edited volume that really thinks about how one might approach the biblical text from a Latino ethnic identity. And then this one, Reading While Black, Dr. Esau McCullough's book. Similar sort of thing, not a collected volume. This one is written by Dr. McCullough himself, and really is thinking about African American or Black biblical interpretation. What are the concerns of Black interpreters? How might we pay attention to what is important to Black persons in the biblical text? Queer Bible Commentary is going to be queer LGBTQIA approaches to a number of different biblical texts, so sort of a little bit more systematically going through the Bible and offering commentary on it from that perspective. Toward an Asian American Biblical Hermeneutics by Dr. Gail A. Yee, Hebrew Bible scholar or Old Testament scholar, is going to be similar to excuse me, these ones up here, approaching the biblical text from the perspective of Asian Americans. Post-colonial criticism by R.S. Sugitharaja is going to really be thinking about post-colonialism and colonialism with respect to the biblical text. The Ancient Christian Commentary on Scripture. This is really a sort of theological approach to exegesis, and this is at present, it's at 29 volumes, but it's a standalone. There are standalone commentaries on many of the different biblical books that basically gives a running list of what different ancient Christians said about that particular text. So really a sort of pre-modern and theological way of approaching the text. There's a related series that's something like the Reformation Commentary on Scripture that says what the different reformers said about the text. So that would be another sort of theological way of engaging the text by looking at its reception across time and in different theological settings. And the last one here is the First Nations version, which is an indigenous translation of the New Testament. So this one is less sort of commentary on the text, but is sort of experiencing the text through an indigenous translation, which is going to bring to the fore indigenous concerns in the reading of the biblical text. All right, so I have talked at you for a little bit right here. So let's take a breather. Let's take just a quick, maybe 5 to 7 minute break on your own to do a lecture pause. So wherever you are doing lecture pauses, maybe in a dedicated handwritten notebook, that would be my suggestion, or in a folder if you prefer to type your answer. So I'm going to ask you 2 questions. I'll put them both up on the screen and ask you to pause, take 5 to 7 minutes reflecting on these 2 questions. So the first one is, what aspects of your own lived experience and social location might be important for your interpretation of the Bible? So what are those things about your own identity, your own upbringing, your own ethnicity, your own embodiment that might affect the way that you approach and interpret the biblical text? And the second question is, which of the previously mentioned approaches might be blind spots in your own thinking? So what are those approaches? What are the sort of identities that you might not have engaged with quite as much? And how might you remedy this? So what are the sort of ideological blind spots that you have? How might you remedy this? So go ahead and pause here, reflect on these questions for about 5 to 7 minutes, and come back and we'll have just a few more slides. All right, welcome back. So the last thing I want to do here is give you some different ways of engaging, or different strategies for engaging the world in front of the text. So we've started the video by thinking about the ways that different scholars or there's different resources for doing this, and really sort of thinking methodologically about how people begin with the world in front of the text and what it means to do engaged exegesis. But I want to turn it back towards you after this lecture pause, where you've started to reflect on your own identity and think about strategies and ways that you yourself might begin exegesis with the world in front of the text. So one way is to think with reception history. Think about the way that a passage has been received in church history. This is where some of those commentary resources that I noted, the Ancient Christian Commentary, the Reformation Bible Commentary, might be really helpful. In world history, so how has the Bible and particular passages shaped politics and the history of the world? How is the Bible presently received in different global communities? So how might a particular passage be read in America versus Africa versus South America? Or other places, and then also the reception of a passage in art. I think one of the most interesting things that one can do in the interpretive process is find different ways that a particular passage has been depicted in art from different times and in different geographical contexts. I think this is really telling about what is important about the text in those to those artists in different places and different times. So one way to engage the passage is to think about its reception in different kinds of contexts. Another way to engage the world in front of the text is to really think about the theological uses of a passage. And this is something that will be important to you if and when you go on to ministry, and if and when you begin preaching from the biblical text regularly. So thinking about how particular passages or particular books have been used in theological debates and in different theological traditions. So some theological traditions tend to value certain genres of text or certain authors more than other ones, or certain passages more than other ones. So how does the particular passage that you are engaging, how has it been used in different theological communities? And then how is it used in your own spiritual formation or other spiritual formations? One way of engaging the world in front of the text is doing a lectio divina, is sitting with the text, reading it a few times through, and really letting it soak into you in a sort of spiritual or sacred kind of way. The third one here is to read from your own social location. So I just asked you in that lecture pause to reflect on your social location. Excuse me. Reflect on those things about your identity that might affect how you interpret the text, and really bring those, sort of lean into those as you interpret the biblical text, to sort of have that aspect of your identity or your social location sort of always in mind as you are reading, and think about how your reading might be one influenced by what you are bringing into the text, but also what might come out of the text in a way that is liberative for you and for your social location. And then finally, reading from someone else's social location. So this really gets to the second question in the lecture pause. I think how you might get better, or how might you might improve your blind spots, is by reading reading persons and reading text written by persons from different social locations or different ethnic identities than your own. This is a way by which sort of we allow more voices to come into the exegetical process. So as you go about engaging particular passages this semester, I encourage you to sort of be on the lookout and be open to reading the ideas of persons who have different social identities and have different social locations than your own. And engage those in ways that sort of are in conversation with your own social location and your own identity. What might you take from someone else, and what might you give to someone else? So really this process of engaging the world in front of the text is thinking about ourselves as readers, thinking about other people as readers, and celebrating that and bringing those things to the text and learning from them.